Welcome to BYJU'S classes. What an eventful week this has been. And we have brought for you again a curated review of international events from all over the world. There are certain developments which may not appear very dramatic to look at. They have occurred in smaller countries, but they are going to have far-reaching implications. So let's begin at once. The events which were most disconcerting were in Thailand. There had been a lull for a short while in the protests for democracy in Thailand, and it appeared that the army, which rules there effectively from behind the curtain, was using monarchy as an excuse and trying to rally around the country, giving them a call for national unity and economic development and so on. And the students had not given up their protests, but the army had not used any hard-handed methods against them to disperse them. But suddenly it came to a breaking point. The monarch decided to return to Thailand, and when he returned to Thailand, maybe just for a day or a few hours, his motorcade was a very carefully planned route was there, but there was jeering on the royal motorcade, and this was really too much for either the monarch, the royal family, or the royalist, or the army that rules in his name to put up with. So they cleared the students and issued them a warning that they would declare a state of emergency, and not even peaceful demonstrations would be allowed anywhere. Now, we might as well note that the demonstrations in Thailand, spearheaded by students and youngsters, have always been peaceful. And so far, at least, the army or the police have not used any high-handed methods. So it has been more or less a game played according to the rules, so to speak, although the students have devised a three-fingered salute, which is about democracy. They have raised questions about monarchy, which was unimaginable a few months back in Thailand, which has very strict lèse majesté laws. But this time, there are two other things which we must bring to your notice. This protest movement took place when the Chinese Foreign Minister Wang Yi was touring Thailand. Now, this is interesting that the Chinese Foreign Minister doesn't visit smaller neighbors so easily unless there is something big at stake. Not only he was there on Thailand on this fateful day, he also made statements saying that he would support Thailand through thick and thin and would stand by Thailand in its moment of need. Now, the signal was that the Chinese were supporting the army which rules behind the facade of a monarchy, and the monarch had planned his visit to Thailand maybe for a day, maybe for a couple of days, to coincide with this visit. Now, the students raised the ante. They surrounded the Prime Minister's office, and this visit, which was supposed to be a high-key visit, became suddenly a hush-hush, low-key visit. We don't even know what was discussed, what was decided, what happened. The Chinese Foreign Minister could not make very many public appearances, and his thunder was stolen, in a manner of speaking, by the students' protest movement, and they are protesting against the monarch's returning, and again raising the pitch of their protest movements. But one cannot neglect what Wang Yi said in Thailand. He revived the old, very, very expensive scheme for a fast train which connects Laos through Thailand to Malaysia. And if this comes through, which has been in the back burner for quite some time, it would be of great strategic advantage to China, because China would not only connect Cambodia, which we discussed in our past lectures with you, has already taken charge of an important port in Cambodia, taken on tourist resorts in Cambodia, and has burdened with its debt the Cambodian government of Hun Sen so heavily that we can't imagine Cambodia moving out of the Chinese orbit in a hurry. Laos is a very meek, weak country, but if Thailand, which has always been an ally of the United States of America through the Cold War, through Vietnam War, moves out of this orbit and heads towards China, things are going to be very, very difficult. Now, the irony is that the Americans, who should have been aware of what is happening in Thailand, a one-time ally where they had very important bases, Da Nang Air Base, etc., are oblivious because of their own troubles at home, the presidential elections, their problems with European Union, NATO, BREXIT, Black Lives Matters, their backyard in Latin America, coronavirus infections, that they have not had time enough to look at Thailand. Now, Thailand again is doubly hit, partly by coronavirus, but much worse by the interruption and break in the tourist traffic. It depends on tourism, it depends on hospitality, and its economy has taken a big hit. Now, at this moment, the Chinese, when they come out with an offer of large-scale financial assistance, it may appear very, very suspicious to the average Thai, but his voice doesn't matter. What matters is the besieged army, which might clutch at these straws and say that, look, as long as the Chinese support us, we don't have to yield to any demands of the students or the protesters. And this seems to be a bit of a replay of the Hong Kong thing, that the protests were very peaceful, but they refused to yield to the pressures from the Chinese side. Here, Chinese are in the background, but the Thai army, if it is reassured that they have the Chinese support, they have started using water cannons with chemically laced water on these student protesters, and they might decide to go for broke. Now, the interesting thing is that the students have still not given up. While the police has said that all demonstrations are illegal, peaceful or otherwise, the students have been cleared of the Royal Palace grounds, they've been cleared outside the Prime Minister's office and residence, but they have started, like the Hong Kong demonstrators, using the social media network and assembling at 3 different places. And the police has reacted in a manner of panic, so to speak. The railway stations are being closed down. It is going to be a shutdown Bangkok story, which would be like the shutdown in Hong Kong, which was replayed several times over the past year before the coronavirus struck them hard. Now, again, the appeals being made by the army are that, look, you are hurting the country. The country's economy is being hurt. Country's strategic interests are being hurt. Monarchy, the institution which holds the country together, is being hurt. So let's rally around together. Now, this is not going to cut ties with the younger generation of Thais who do not have the same respect for the present monarch as they had for his father. They do not believe that the monarchy is relevant for present day Thailand. They think the army is only using the facade of monarchy to continue a martial law, and they dislike the very unpopular General Prayut, who took over through a coup in 2014. And earlier, the Thai army had cracked down on protesters hard before, but this time it is almost all the young population of the country, not only in Bangkok but elsewhere in the provinces, rising in revolt. So probably the slogans already greeting the policemen are, "You have blood on your hands, go out, resign and go back." And some of them are prepared, like the Hong Kong protesters, with hard hats, so they know that they are going to face brute force and they are prepared to retaliate. So this is going to be difficult for Thailand, but not only difficult for Thailand, it has implications for its neighbors. Malaysia is going through a bit of a constitutional crisis. It probably doesn't have time to devote attention to Thailand. And as we said before, if Chinese gain a toehold through army at this juncture, it would be detrimental to Indian interests, because once they get access to Thai ports, they can again revive the Isthmus of Kra Canal project, which the Indians have been trying to cope with, fast movement, highway developing, connecting these 2 points on east and west of the Kra. But once this happens, the Chinese would have access, far more easy access to Indian Ocean through Cambodia, through Laos, through Thailand, through Myanmar, and they would be in a position to dominate the region, not only in South China Sea, but in the Indian Ocean. So we have to watch these developments very, very carefully. It is not only a question of democracy versus autocracy, absolute monarchy and martial law versus aspirations for democratic aspirations of the youth. It is also a country whose economy is in a very bad shape, and the rulers are desperate to get economic assistance and revive the economy, in which stage the Chinese temptation may be too strong to resist. Nagorno-Karabakh in Caucasus seems to be suffering from a mysterious curse. Nobody really believed that the truce brokered by Russia would work for long, but at least it was hoped that there would be respite bought enough for negotiations to take place in Minsk or somewhere else, for the unfortunate 2 neighbors to stop fighting and probably cut down the cost of loss of lives or economic losses. But that was not to be. The truce was hardly announced while the fighting broke up again, and lots of people, civilian targets, have been hit on both sides, lives lost, and the fighting continues to go on. Now, there are 2 ways of looking at it. Some people look at it in a manner suggesting that Putin's influence has reduced to an extent where Turkey refused to accept what it is advised to do in Azerbaijan, and Russia, despite its treaty of friendship and military security, is reluctant to directly intervene in favor of Armenia. It of course sells arms to both parties. It is dependent on both for its passage of its oil and gas to Europe, but that is somehow or other doesn't reflect very well on the image of Putin. But there are those who think that Putin is playing a far deeper, far more devious and dangerous game. What he is trying to do is to drive a wedge in the NATO. What happens is that Turkey is a member of NATO, and if he has succeeded in selling S-400 missiles to Turkey, which Turkey has also tried out, it amounts to saying that Turkey is prepared to flout the advice of its senior partner, even United States of America, and is willing to continue with its adventures in the Caucasus. So what is happening is a very strange, volatile, explosive mix which we might see with unforeseen consequences in future of dogmatic, fundamentalist, intolerant Islam of the Turkish variety combining with communist dictatorship of the Stalinist variety in Putin's Russia, combining together to eliminate US influence in this region. So if this happens, it is going to lead to some very unfortunate consequences. Neither Armenia nor Azerbaijan, because both sides have come out with chauvinistic statements, have raked up racial memories of past, and this lack of harmony is going to continue to disturb everybody. On one side, Azerbaijan is trying to claim as much territory as it can, so what it had lost to Armenia earlier is regained. Armenia in the meantime thinks that Azerbaijan is going to hold a threat to its future as long as it is supported and allied by Turkey, and it can't trust Russia too much on this. There are other small gains for Russia elsewhere, but the major gain would be if it can divide the NATO alliance and wound it mortally for once. The interesting thing is that Russia has also in the meantime come out in the support of Belarus dictator, and the democratic movement in Belarus has more or less, if not died down, it is not on as much of a momentum as it once was seen to gaining, and this probably means that Lukashenko might survive, but Russia might extract its pound of flesh there, so it might be able to reassert its control there. Now, nobody in his right senses or her right senses believes that Turkey can take on the might of Russia in its own backyard. But how long this marriage of convenience will continue, not only in Caucasus, but Turkey and Putin in Syria, Libya, elsewhere is interesting. One other thing which people are reluctant to talk about is that if Turkey succeeds in asserting its control or dominance in the Eastern Mediterranean, then the Russians probably are having a long-term game plan where they can probably, coordination with Turkey, dominate the oil and gas market and the reserves in this entire area. So this is something which nobody is speculating. It is in the realm of distant future, what would be the future of fossil fuels, but this is something which we have to watch. As was apprehended, the conflict in Nagorno-Karabakh is not between two small Caucasian neighbors, Azerbaijan and Armenia, which remain on the margins of international relations. It really involves Putin's Russia, it involves Turkey resurgent, and it also probably underlines the cracks in NATO and the reluctance of the United States to assert itself in this region. We also witnessed the resurgence of an old-fashioned skirmishing of the Cold War somewhere else last week. This was in Norway, where the foreign minister of Norway charged Russia for having mounted a cyber attack on its parliament, which she said was unacceptable, and asked the Russian envoy in that country to explain the conduct. Now this is interesting because Russia and Norway are Arctic neighbors, and they share a 120-mile long border in the Arctic Circle. There has been cooperation between the two countries so far, but there have been signs in past that hostility was building up. There were several reasons for that. Russia has accelerated its exploration of Arctic. It's been having nuclear-powered submarines there. It has icebreakers there, better equipped than any other country in the world. Now, other countries have been trying to use Norway to have their Arctic stations on its territory. Not only the Americans, Canada is much closer, but then the British have deployed some Marines, not Marines, they call them commandos, equivalent of the American Marines, in Norway. And because this the Russians consider as a NATO allies deployment, they consider it a security threat to themselves. So it is likely that they are putting Norway under pressure. There have been in past cases in the past few years when there have been these kinds of tensions in the relations between these two Arctic neighbors, and where is a freezing Cold War, some have referred it to. Former security services member went on a trip to Moscow and never returned, and his only crime was that he had posted a snowbound red square photograph on his Facebook. He was arrested in Moscow, and nobody has heard about it ever after that. And it was said that he was spying. He was part of a espionage network. Some 3,000 euros were found on him. But knowing the opacity of such inquiries in Russia, nobody knows what is happening. So this was one thing. There also was, on Norway's part, they had arrested a British citizen accused of passing off some nuclear secrets from a power plant to the Russians. So there has been these accusations, counter-accusations, and the Russians have been accused of cyber warfare against its enemies, targeting sometimes their friends also. So there is a lot that we don't see on the surface, but it is likely not to reduce tension. Now this might be again one of the Putin's game plans, not only have a deep divide in NATO, as it is doing with Turkey's assistance, but also to separate the North European countries, put them under pressure so they are not in a position to have a united front with the rest of the EU when EU thinks of planning a sterner negotiating stance vis-a-vis Russia. Because the Russians have been on the target of the EU for human rights violations, suppressions of democratic movements, and so on. So this Norway story, we are likely to hear more about it in near future. Another event last week full of ironies was the election of new members to the United Nations Human Rights Commission. The 3 members elected were Pakistan, China and Russia. And the whole world knows that these 3 are the countries which are accused of gravest violations, blatant violations of human rights. The only country which lost the election was Saudi Arab, so we might as well not discuss Saudi Arab. Saudi Arab has been a target of similar accusations ever since journalist Khashoggi's murder. But then, these 3 countries, China has been accused of brutally suppressing the democratic dissent and movement, peaceful movement of youngsters in Hong Kong. It has been accused of almost genocidal oppression of Uyghur Muslims in Xinjiang. Tibet always has been an issue, and they have not allowed dissenters to express an opinion other than praise, uninhibited praise for Xi within China itself. There have also been accusations of violations of labor rights, exploiting them like bonded labor, even the Chinese, and the restrictions on the media there. If you take the Pakistanis, they have been accused of turning a blind eye to the oppression, suppression of minorities, not only of Christians and Hindus and Sikhs, but also of Shias and other minority sects. There has been violent crime against dissenters in Balochistan, in Sindh, and all this is really seems to be particularly ridiculous that Pakistan and China should be now sitting on a body which decides which other countries violate human rights. Russia is no exception. Very recently there was this case of Navalny, a main opponent of Putin, who was poisoned with a rare poison in Siberia. He barely recovered because he was managed to be airlifted to Germany in time. Putin, of course, and Russia denies any complicity in this thing, but is too much of a coincidence that anybody who criticizes Putin or Russia suddenly becomes victim of a rare radioactive substance or a rare untraceable poison, almost always lethal. There also have been accusations of independent journalists being killed, media being stifled, political parties being sabotaged, people not being allowed to contest elections. Now, Putin might manage to control opposition in Russia itself. But when it comes to Putin's complicity in human rights violations elsewhere, his support for the dictator Lukashenko in Belarus, so Belarus dictator might stay. We haven't heard of the dissent there for some time. Putin might extract his pound of flesh there, but this again is at the cost of human rights violations. So whether it is Ukraine, whether it is Belarus, whether it is Russia itself, Russia, China and Pakistan are not exactly the ideal candidates for the Human Rights Commission in the United Nations. People are asking questions. Shouldn't there be structural reform in UN which does away with regional representation, which does away with election in General Assembly, and which disqualifies some people from contesting if they are violators of human rights themselves? So this is something which makes a mockery of the whole human rights regime. This, how it will affect other nation states, how credible will this body remain, is a very big question. And India should not remain indifferent to this, because India itself is put in dock by certain countries in Western Europe, at times by certain political sections in America, for violating human rights of minority, partly due to the mischief of Pakistan, partly due to the collusion and complicity of countries like Turkey and Malaysia, and partly like China egging on countries like this. So we have a consistently good record in human rights. We have supported the protection of human rights all over the world. But in recent times, there have been certain cases where non-governmental organization like Amnesty International has closed its office in India and moved away. And there has been criticism of lack of tolerance in India of minorities and dissent, and also a dissent in peaceful places, although the Supreme Court has declared that freedom of expression and peaceful protest is a fundamental right, but there have been curbs put that you can only do it in certain places, and the law and order is primarily the realm of the responsibility of executive. So the executive, as long as it is not confronted by judiciary, the impression created to the world elsewhere is that India also is circumscribing these freedoms. So this is what I think is a delicate issue which India has to keep in mind. The day Columbus set foot on the Western Hemisphere is celebrated as the Columbus Day. But this year it was celebrated in a unique manner. The indigenous people toppled the statue of Theodore Roosevelt. They toppled the statue of Columbus. They painted the faces with black paint, darkened them, and declared as a day of rage of the indigenous people, not as a day of discovery of America, because the indigenous people, who are euphemistically referred to in Canada and elsewhere as First Nation, the indigenous original people, they have a grievance which probably is no less important to be redressed or addressed as people of color. Now, the people of color claim about slavery. The indigenous people, the people who belong to the First Nation, they believe that they were genocidally destroyed, their country was claimed and colonized, and the people became liberators and revolutionaries for the rest of the world. So this, unfortunately, is that they had been given certain reservations, but ever since globalization gathered momentum, their sanctuaries, their reserves have been violated in Canada, in America a long time back, and in Latin America in the Amazon rainforest. This is the grievance of the indigenous people in Brazil. This is the grievance of indigenous people in Canada, where gas pipeline was rammed through their reserve to the Pacific coast. And this anguish is going to spread like the Black Lives Matter movement to Australia and New Zealand. Now again, this is interesting that Australia and New Zealand are also in a tight corner at the moment because of their confrontation with the Chinese. The Australian economy is under pressure. Australia has been accused of some kind of racism against Asians, particularly the Chinese, but this gives an opportunity to the indigenous people, the Maoris and the others, to say that, look, we also are an aggrieved party, our grievances have not been looked at and only a tokenism has been there. So this pressure might build up of indigenous people elsewhere. There might be global alliance of indigenous people who call themselves First Nations on the tribals who might have a confrontation with non-tribal, non-indigenous people, and this is an issue fraught with very, very explosive possibilities. Who's indigenous? Who's the original inhabitant of the place? Who are the outsiders? Where are the invaders? Has there been an intermixture of blood? What happens to the mixed blood people? This is particularly true of the Latin American continent, where in Argentina, where in Brazil, Peru and Chile, Mexico, etc. These things are very, very important, and particularly in the Latin American continent, certain other things have been causing disturbances and apprehensions. Argentina declared that it had suddenly increased its territory by having a new method following the United Nations Convention on Laws to extend its territorial waters, its exclusive economic zone, and almost touches a big part of the Antarctic. Chile lays the same kind of a claim, and obviously the two claims clash. And the Argentinian claim also sweeps in the Falkland and the Malvinas. So there is a possibility of a conflict with United Kingdom. Now, United Kingdom, beset with all kinds of difficulties post-Brexit, might find this convenient to rally around nationalistic support for this issue. Experts believe that Argentina doesn't believe that it can reclaim these islands, but it only is a negotiating bargaining chip to have fisheries rights in its own waters secured for a longer time to come. The problem of indigenous people, which everybody thinks is a microscopic minority in the Western developed nations, but it is not so if you come to Latin America. It is not so if you take thinly populated Australia and New Zealand and take the totality of people even in Papua and New Guinea and the Pacific microstates. It was being said that if by 15th October no agreement is arrived at between Britain and the European Union about Brexit, there will have to be no deal. Britain will have to go out without a deal, and it will put great pressure on both Britain and EU after that. Everything not being resolved would remain unresolved. The Irish backstop, the subsidy given to the industries, the fisheries, the traffic hassles, permissions to stay to the nationals of either EU or Britain in either side, what would happen to the Channel Tunnel, what would happen to the visa arrangements, what would happen to the courts, etc. But now it seems this deadline has also passed. No agreement has been reached. Some people say that Boris Johnson's bluff has been called, but Boris Johnson still refuses to blink, keeps to swagger, and tells his countrymen that better prepare for this, because any price is good enough to pay to reclaim one's own sovereignty. Then United Kingdom would be free to have a deal like Australia or Canada with EU. Now, this in itself is a very confusing kind of a message, because if you analyze it carefully, Australia has no special relationship with EU. The relationship of Australia with EU is governed only by WTO and the regime, which is already fairly weakened thanks to President Trump of the World Trade. As far as Canada is concerned, Canada also has a very inequitable kind of a relationship with the European Union, but Canada doesn't depend like Britain on its trade with the European Union. Majority of its trade is taken care of by America or the North American continent, and the Canadians are not so dependent on EU. The other part of their chunk is dependent with their deal with China, their deal with Commonwealth countries, Britain itself. So Boris Johnson saying that the best case scenario is a Canada type deal, worst case scenario is an Australia type deal, is only to confuse his electorate. He says that prepare for the worst and is not a bad idea, we regain our sovereignty. Now this again, anybody analyzing it carefully would see that the Britain had been so zealously guarding its own security, its own currency, its own visa system, that it is really not going to regain too much of its sovereignty. And what does it mean in terms of? But then the question which people can ask is, why is European Union dilly-dallying so far? The answer is simple. Because the countries in European Union, especially France and Germany, France especially, realizes that a no-deal Brexit is going to hurt it also. President Macron goes to elections in another 18 months' time, And if he cannot tell his voters that he has secured some favorable deal out of Brexit in terms of fisheries, that the French fishermen on the coast can fish in English Channel, or if they are restricted there, that they will have a larger chunk of carved out of UK share of the European waters, he is going to pay a price of this in elections. As it is, Macron is on the defensive, because Macron's defense of secularism and human rights has already started extracting a price. A French teacher who had shown a caricature of Muhammad the Prophet in his classroom was beheaded by a zealot jihadi in France last week, and although the assailant was shot dead, but the conspiracy maybe will never be found out, whether he was a lone wolf, whether it's a network of jihadis in France. So the France has to live with, call it by any name, an Islamophobia or a real threat of terror. It has to live with reduced livelihood opportunities due to COVID, and in addition to the tunnel to UK, the fisheries in the English Channel. So the European Union also wants to have something positive to come out of this. And Britain, of course, thinks that if the talks linger on, is better than having a break in the talks. So the deadline has passed, 15th October has passed, heavens have not fallen, and they say that as long as talks are on, European negotiators have taken a train to UK, and there is hope that something might be redeemed yet. But what can be redeemed would be of very limited value, because enough damage has been done to the institutions put in place over the years, whether judicial, customs, trade, tariff, or travel negotiations. So I think Brexit is going to extract a cost both on European Union and Britain. They might give up the impression that the show is going on, but I think enough ill will has been created, and Boris Johnson has shown repeatedly that he can mismanage almost everything from COVID to educational system. His favorite advisor, Mr. Cummings, continues advising him about futuristic plans and so on. Repeated cases of conflict of interest come. His senior advisors resign. There is a revolt in his own party about his Brexit diplomacy or lack of it, but this continues. The Indian Foreign Minister, Dr. Jaishankar, came out with a very curious statement last week. Speaking in a colloquium, he said that India and China are continuing their dialogue to de-escalate the crisis in Ladakh and elsewhere in the border. But he also said that these negotiations are very confidential. They can't be shared. Their progress cannot be shared. Next day or the day after that, he also made a statement where he said the Chinese attack in Galwan was a shock. It changed the relationship between China and India quite drastically. Now, you can't have it both ways. This is what had happened exactly in Nehruvian period, where China-India relations and negotiations were conducted behind a cloak of secrecy. The parliament and the public wanted to know what was happening, and there was a denial of the ground realities. And then subsequently, ex post facto, there were explanations, and there was a dedicated mission to find scapegoats and so on. This seems to be a replay of that. While the defense minister names China, the external affairs minister avoids naming China. This was the first time he said, we have had a problem with China after the Galwan attack. But then you cannot say that we are having dialogue, there is no other way than dialogue. At the same time, you say the Chinese refuse to budge from their position, and the Chinese have made it very clear that they are not going to withdraw. They have given Indians an option to vacate Chushul, and Indians had crossed over and taken over positions on certain fingers of Pangong Lake. They want them to be vacated. Now, the Chinese are insistent that all of this territory belongs to them. And if India concedes that through any negotiations, and if India's position is that this is not negotiable, then what is the point of continuing with the talks and conducting them behind a cloak of secrecy? But then what about the military preparedness? So you cannot have the defense minister and the home minister giving one message, and the rest of the ministers in the central cabinet saying that China is the enemy, boycott this, boycott that, and at the same time, the external affairs ministry is treating China with kid gloves. So this is something which is concerning Indians very much vis-a-vis China, and the Chinese aggressive postures from Thailand to Nepal to Sri Lanka remain unchanged. After alienating Nepal from India, China has started claiming Nepalese territory on the border of Nepal, and there have been all kinds of accusations about Chinese bribing Nepalese leaders like Prachanda and Oli. There has been opposition parties mounting demonstrations against the Nepalese government, but that is their internal affair. What we only should keep in mind is that China doesn't yield an inch of what it claims as its territory, whether it is Nepal, or whether it is India, or whether it is any other country, or whether it is the water body in South China Sea. So that is something which India should keep in mind, and there are limits of negotiations on territorial disputes with China. While different corners in the world were in turmoil, America continued to be engrossed in the presidential elections. Obviously, after the last disastrous exchange between Biden and Trump, Trump was stricken by coronavirus and Biden was reluctant to have a face-to-face debate with him. Trump, one did not know whether he was clear in his mind, had it defogged or not, but it was decided that they would not have a second round of the debate but would have two simultaneous town halls. But that's besides the point. What America is reeling under, besides the presidential election concerns, is a massive resurgence of the coronavirus. More than 8 million people have been infected with the virus. Cities like New York and Los Angeles and San Francisco, and this is also sharpening the cleavage between the whites and the colored people. It is the rich and the poor people, the coastal areas and the privileged living areas, and also the areas where the poor live in the heartland. Now, this is also going to put pressure on the United States of America even after the presidential election. How do they cope with this? How do they contain it? They have the best medical system. They may say that other countries are fudging their figures, we are testing more, so our figures are there. But the pressure in America is also the greatest to open up the economy, to go back to normalization. Especially the younger people are prepared to take the risk. The university is open. The coronavirus is spread. Suddenly there is a surge. The institutions are closed. Bars are open. Gyms are open. Then they are closed. Places of worship are common and closed. And especially because of the presidential election, the supporters of President Trump take great pride in flouting, not observing the protocols, not wearing masks, and still poo-pooing that this is nothing. And of course, President Trump himself says that now I am immune. Now I have already been infected and tested negative once with corona, so I can go ahead and do what I want. But the signaling he is doing is not doing anybody any good. And America, as long as it copes with the presidential election excitement and the corona crisis and the economy sluggish, it has no inclination or energy to intervene elsewhere in the world where a crisis is developing, whether it is Turkey, Caucasus, whether it is Iran, Afghanistan, or whether it is China, elsewhere in Southeast Asia. And India should not think that American support would be there when it needs it most in its confrontation with China or Pakistan. So Pakistan has also been having problems. There has been large-scale demonstrations against Prime Minister Imran Khan. So one can speculate that whether his honeymoon with the army is over or whether it is deliberately being done to say that he can control this and emerge even more charismatic, more powerful, more effective. But this is not going to help India. The Pakistanis are trying to create some confusion. The spokesperson of the Pakistani External Affairs Ministry said that India has sent a message to resume dialogue with them. The Indian External Affairs Ministry immediately refuted this. But then why was this kite flown? We don't know. Lots of things happen in diplomacy which are on a deniability principle. But unfortunately, because of the American presidential elections, and the corona particularly virulently striking America, is going to keep America out of the international relations till November and beyond, and till that time much might happen. That's all for this week. We hope you enjoyed the presentation, and we also hope that you are reviewing these events and trying to interrelate them and trying to see how events in one part of the world are likely to impact on something small in another part of the world, which may snowball into a bigger crisis very soon. Also, what are the possibilities of diffusing a crisis, managing a crisis, controlling an explosive situation, and to what extent a dialogue can be meaningful or otherwise, or are we getting into a trap, walking into a mirage of a peaceful settlement of a dispute where none is possible? There are situations in international affairs where the clash of interest, national interest, is irreconcilable. And it is better to accept that. It doesn't mean that we go to war, but it means that we realize there are limits of diplomacy, limits of unilateral confidence building measures, and we should prepare for the worst if it comes. Look forward to seeing you here next week. Thank you and goodbye till then.